The Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank released its latest estimate for what is going to happen to the gross domestic product of the United States this year, 2025. The most recent, earlier estimate a few weeks ago was in line with a general notion that it would be somewhere around 2%, maybe a bit more. The number released yesterday is that the GDP in this year of the United States will decline by 2.8%. That's called a major recession. That's the prediction of the Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank. And that information changes in a worsening direction almost anything and everything we can talk about. The impact of the tariffs, the war economies that are being revved up in Europe. What we are seeing is a level of desperate acts that are desperate because even though the chances of their succeeding are small, enormous risks are being taken for the small chance of a good outcome. That's the definition of desperate. So, for example, the Europeans. The Europeans are watching, and it's so important for folks to understand this. Europe was the center of the universe for most of the last 15 centuries, at least for most of us. It was where we talked about the great Roman Empire, where we talked about the feudal 1,000 years, where we talked about the explosive development of modern capitalism, and where we talked about colonialism. And what was that? Europe taking over the rest of this planet one way or another. In all of that, the United States is a footnote, okay? What we are seeing is that center of so much of world history, Europe, becoming a small side story. That ought to show people how deep the changes are we are living through. Europe has already been completely sidelined in terms of modern economics. The modern global economy, which is more global than it has ever been, is divided between two powerful centers: the United States and its major allies, the so-called G7, and China and its major allies, namely China and the BRICS. They were roughly equal as China rose and Europe, America declined. They hit an equal level around the year 2020. Since that time, because China and the BRICS have grown so much faster than the United States and Europe, they are now no longer equal. G7, Europe and America basically account for about 28% of the world's output. China and the BRICS account for 35% of the world's output. They're already ahead of us. And if there's a recession this year, while growth in China is scheduled to be in the neighborhood of 5%, well, it'll only get worse. We are watching Europe become irrelevant. It's not in this story. It used to be a sidecar of the United States. And that sidecar has just had the button pressed. It's off on its own. It cannot keep up with the technological advances of Silicon Valley in the US and of China in the rest of the world. They are the dominant, fill in the blank, everything in economics. And Europe isn't in everything in economics. With great fanfare, the leaders of Europe are talking about, as you rightly pointed, we're upping our defense spending. Von Leyen says, the German woman who's in charge of the EU, says we're going to spend, and then she pauses for effect, $680 billion. Then she adds in a low tone, over the next 4 years. $680 billion puts you in kindergarten. These are numbers that don't matter. And most of that is supposed to be spent to help Ukraine, which is pouring that down the drain. So they'll build up a defense, spend it in Ukraine, and then they won't even have it. It's a bad joke. The public relations may work for people who don't know, but for anyone paying attention, Europe is plunging into irrelevance globally from having been the dominant leader of everything globally. That's the crucial thing. Yeah, the defense companies in Europe will get some more contracts. They're happy. But the only way the Europeans can shovel resources into defense is if they take them away from everything else at a time when the European economy is already in trouble. The strongest country in Europe is Germany. It is in a recession as I speak with you. They're going to have to take money away from all the social services that Europeans have demanded and forced their governments to give them. Social services that Americans can't even imagine. Let me remind you all, in France, a country I know real well, so I'll use it as an example, but it's true for most of the others, at least in the Western part. Once you go to work, you graduate high school or college, your employer is required to give you 5 weeks of fully paid vacation every year. That's the law. Doesn't depend on a union contract. It's the law. You get medical insurance for illness or injury from the day of your birth to the day of your death. Period. Going to college, the tuition in France is 0. On and I could go on. Those things are now going to be taken away in order to fund defense, which will still leave Europe far behind the United States in military capability and far behind the Russians and the Chinese working together now. And so it's too late for Europe, and they don't know what to do, and they're going to now do defense. A silly mistake that will be rude in the years ahead. It is really extraordinary. They are acting as though they are not in the position they're in. Psychologists call this denial. The United States is showing how desperate by comparison it is. It is turning on its allies. So desperate is it to make its situation better that is going to whack Canada and whack Mexico with the tariffs that went into effect this morning. Wow. Jettisoning Europe, all the allies. When the ship is in trouble, it throws what it had on board, even if those things were valuable, overboard in order to make it through the storm. That's what we're seeing. And when you look at the policies, whether it's the tariff or it's the kissing Europe goodbye, you're seeing what in football is called a Hail Mary pass. It's when the quarterback, knowing that defeat is imminent, leans back and heaves the ball down the field, having told his teammates to run in that direction in the hope that the ball will bounce around in the air and eventually come down in the arms of someone on his team rather than the opposing team. Is that possible? Yes. If you ask me, is this collection of desperate acts actually going to save the situation? Is it possible? Yes. But it's possible in the same way that a Hail Mary pass is possible. It's not likely. It's not a reasonable thing to do. It's not something you would ever do unless you were desperate. Americans have got to understand this, or else they will see each step in this disaster all by itself without understanding the larger process in which we are now involved. And believe me, if the prediction of the Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank is correct, and most economists will think it is, they have a good record down there, of making these kinds of predictions, then we are beginning only at the beginning of the troubles that are going to beset this economy. Capitalism crashes every 4 to 7 years in every country, wherever it has gone. That's why we know about economic downturns. That's why we have all the variables that the Atlanta Federal Reserve has to put in their computer to calculate, we're due for another one now. Every 4 to 7 years. The last one was in 2020 when the pandemic hit. And what are we now? 5 years later. Bingo, right on schedule. Capitalism is a system that does this. But if you put together the crises that recur every few years with longer range historical shifts, like what has happened in China and Russia, like the history of Europe that we just summarized, then you're talking about too many things coming together at the same time. It's like, again, in our personal lives, we can handle a crisis over here and then another one over there. But if there's a crisis on the job and a crisis in your love life and a crisis with your children, it's too many. Any one of them you could navigate. We are getting to the point. That's why we have Mr. Trump. It's not that he's odd. What's odd is that an odd person like that would be the president of a country. That's a sign that everything is shaking.